There is a battle brewing in the United States, a battle over education. A growing conservative-led movement is campaigning to crack down on what schools teach children, and that has put classrooms and libraries like this one at the front lines of America's culture wars again.
A bunch of these books I brought here. Seahorse, we're going to hear today from the great Ruby Bridges.
We're going to take a look at why America is witnessing a new wave of book bans. We'll hear from both sides of the debate over what schools should teach.
It is teaching kids to dislike one another based on the color of their skin.
What conversations are you having with your kid about race? That's part of the problem, that we're not talking about these things.
And we'll find out how it's all part of America's deepening political divide.
What are the core values that you want to teach kids so that we can live together in this country?
Let's take a look at one book at the center of a controversy. Ruby Bridges was the first Black student to desegregate a New Orleans school in 1960. This image of her, surrounded by U.S. Marshals, made her a civil rights hero. She was just 6 years old. This illustrated book, The Story of Ruby Bridges, is taught in schools across the country. But some of the images and words have a group of parents in Tennessee sounding the alarm. We went to Williamson County, just outside Nashville, to find out why. This is Dr. Beth Myers, a former educator who disapproves of how schools are teaching race, gender, and history. We meet her at the home of Robin Steenman, the leader of the local Moms for Liberty chapter. That's a conservative organization that says it advocates for parents' rights. Both women object to some well-known books on the public school reading lists, and they reject the way Wit and Wisdom teaches those books. It's a national curriculum that's been adopted here in Tennessee, and it includes the story of Ruby Bridges.
The message to my daughter is, Ruby was courageous. Be like Ruby. Go change the world and make it better the way she did. But the way Wit and Wisdom teaches it is very divisive and racially charged, and it focuses 100% on the negatives and how, the white people were racist and what they did to Ruby, and it just leaves kids feeling bad. History should be taught, absolutely, warts and all. But just teach history without, agenda or ideology or trying to put a child in one box or another, because history has the lessons of its own.
Steenman says the school curriculum is steeped in critical race theory. What is critical race theory? It's an academic concept that focuses on how racism is systemic, anchored in policies and laws.
In the universities, this is called critical race theory.
Critical race theory.
Critical race theory.
And it has a symbol of Satan.
It's become a rallying cry for conservative parents across the country who believe it is divisive and gives white children a negative self-image.
Part of the way this is being taught is that you are in groups. Your identity is group identity. When you, again, focus on differences, how do we have unity? This country is polarized badly. How do we unify that?
We head to the main square to hear the other side of the argument from Ravita Raman and Jennifer Cortez, who started a group called One Wilco to advocate for students of color. They believe Black and white children are ready for the Ruby Bridges story and tough conversations about race.
All you have to do is explain to children, and they get it. We don't give our kids enough credit to handle the conversations that we have. And unfortunately for me, I have to have difficult conversations with my children on a regular basis, to let them know how they're perceived, how they can't do certain things, how you can't take your candy in the grocery store because you may be accused of stealing or something. So it's a lot of difficulty. Ruby Bridges experienced that when she was in the first grade, so she can experience it. She experiences that every day. So why is her experience discounted and your white child is experience more valuable? That's unfair.
And Jennifer Cortez says the claim that schools are teaching divisive and racist dogma just isn't true.
I asked my daughter, who is white, did you feel guilty after reading the story of Ruby Bridges? She said, no, I felt sad. I said, did you feel sad that you were white? She said, no, I felt sad that Miss Bridges went through that, and I felt sad that the white people in the story didn't find something better to do. I understand the concern, but respectfully, that is a white concern. I have the luxury of not having to think about my skin color here where I live and where I've grown up, because it has always been, if anything, an advantage or a non-issue. But for many children and many families, that's not the case.
Still, the book ban movement has picked up steam. Last year, the Tennessee General Assembly banned critical race theory from schools. A teacher in one county was fired for referring to white privilege in his lessons. It goes well beyond critical race theory, too. In another Tennessee county, a school board banned the Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel Mouse for what was deemed an overly rough depiction of the Holocaust. Conservative groups oppose how schools are teaching gender and sexuality as well. In Florida, the Republican governor has even pulled math books for being too woke because they included references to racial prejudice. It's all adding up. The American Library Association says last year there were 729 challenges to library, school, and university materials and services. That is the highest number of attempted book bans since the organization started compiling these lists 20 years ago. Most of the books being targeted are by or about Black or LGBTQ people. The Nashville Public Library has now curated a banned books collection for its patrons. This movement has been driven in large part by religious conservatives who see these books as a threat to their worldview and to America. Their concern has grown as public institutions have become more secular, but it's nothing new. We asked Andrew Hartman, professor of history at Illinois State University and author of a book about America's culture wars, about the history of banning books in the USA.
So this is a common feature in American history, and has a lot to do with the sort of larger context of the culture wars. In some ways, which have always been a part of American history, this debate between largely religious conservatives and largely secular liberals that goes back to the 1920s in many ways, but really has been heightened ever since the 1960s and the liberation movements, civil rights, feminism, gay rights.
It's not just the US, and it's not just now. One of the most iconic examples in recent history, the Nazis banning and burning books they deemed subversive. China's Cultural Revolution forbid anything that didn't conform to the party's political ideology. And in the US, a controversy that got national media attention. In 1974, a conservative county in West Virginia attempted to introduce multicultural textbooks and sparked violent demonstrations, with at least 3 elementary schools attacked with firebombs. So what makes this wave of book bans different? Well, it's more partisan than before, pitting Republicans against Democrats.
It has become largely Republicans who support the conservative, largely white religious or white evangelical parents. And oftentimes, Republican politicians are frankly opportunistic about sort of ginning up support for themselves, for their candidacies, for their positions, because these are issues that animate their base. I don't think the roots or origins of these issues are partisan. They're much more sort of based in a religious or philosophical or ethical framework about an understanding about the world that has divided the Americans for a very long time.
The religious right is now occupying the heart of the Republican Party. So things like critical race theory have become big mainstream Republican talking points. Conservatives say they are under existential threat from social issues in books and schools and institutions. But what does the average American think? Well, polls consistently show that the majority of Americans don't want the type of book bans that we're seeing across the U.S. right now. But that does not mean that the current wave of bans will slow.